Hello, good day to all. This is again Miss A. Krishna Sundar, Assistant Professor, Department of English from KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri. We are back again with the author Philip Larkin, and today we will be discussing more about his works and style. In order to understand the quality of a writer's work, we have to understand the writer first. Larkin was basically a shy and reclusive character. He was noted for his humor, but at the same time he was not considered as a funny poet. He made use of wry humor, which means a very dry kind of humor including cynicism and social satire. He was not a writer who wrote many poems. His works were limited, but they marked the quality of his writings. In the entirety of Larkin's life, he published only 4 collections of poetry. Erich Homburger called him the saddest heart in the post-war supermarket. Now let us have a look at the influences that Larkin had. It was mentioned in the previous slide that he was introduced to many great writers in the history of English literature by his father. Larkin was deeply influenced by W.B. Yeats and Thomas Hardy. If you look at the poems of Yeats, you can see that they have a philosophical touch. If you have read poems like Second Coming and Byzantium, you will understand that the poetry of Yeats is very complex and obscure. But if you look at the works written by Larkin, you cannot see this kind of a complexity. Moreover, Yeats as a poet included a number of mythological allusions in his poetry. But if you look at the works of Larkin, they look very simple for an ordinary reader. Similarly, if we are to look at the works of Thomas Hardy, there is a kind of difficulty and convolutedness that Hardy employs. But this kind of an obscurity is not seen with Larkin's works. Now let us have a look at the themes employed by Larkin. Of the many themes that he employed in his works, the most important one was in fact England. England was one of his major themes. Larkin also had a deep sense of loss regarding the English countryside. He was very disappointed with the changing country. England was slowly moving into the industrial phase after the Second World War, and Larkin was not very happy about this. Larkin wrote about ordinary instances around us, and as a reader, we could easily associate with Larkin's poems. He was also a keen observer, and he noticed everything happening around him. Now let us discuss the particular style that Larkin employs. As a writer, Larkin is often considered as a realistic poet. His poems are very much closer to reality. Moreover, most of his poems appear in the form of a conversational tone. He employs colloquial words which makes it very easy for the reader to connect with. He also has a very mature style in his poetry. And it is believed that this matured style actually came from the reading of Hardy's work. One of the major themes that he employed was his concerns about the middle class. He always used to take the pedestal of an ordinary English man. Another important quality about his work is its intelligibility. And intelligibility means the power of these poems to connect directly with its audience or the reader. He gave a lot of attention to even minor things. At the same time, he employed cynicism and social satire. He always reflected the common man's themes. And most of his poems were actually drawn from his own experiences. Above all, readers loved Larkin very much. Now, this has to be considered in a very serious way because most of the writers whom we consider as celebrated writers today never got real appreciation at the time when they lived. If you look at the poems written by Robert Browning, we know that they are considered as classic works today. The poems like The Last Duchess or The Laboratory. But at the same time, Browning was not a very recognized or a popular poet at the time when he lived. But Larkin is different here because many writers in English literature got the real appreciation and celebration decades after their death. But Larkin was very fortunate in this matter that readers loved all the works that he wrote. Now let us have a look at the major works written by Larkin. As I told you, there are just 4 collections of poetry that Larkin wrote. The first one is titled as The North Ship. The second one is titled as The Less Deceived. The third one, The Whitsun Weddings. And the fourth one, High Windows. To look at the year of publication, we can see that The North Ship was published in the year 1945. The Less Deceived was published in the year 1955. The Whitsun Weddings in 1964 and High Windows in the year 1974. If you take a look at the year of publication, we can see that there is a gap of around 10 years between the works. So it is very clear that Larkin's writings were not hasty writings, and probably that could be the one major reason why his poetry looked very concrete, profound, and mature. Larkin also tried his luck with the writing of plays. He published the play titled as Jill in the year 1946 and A Girl in Winter in the year 1947. But he was not very popular with his plays. We cannot understand Larkin completely if we do not understand what movement poetry is. So let's have a look at what movement poetry is. Now, movement poetry began during the early 1950s. It was applied since 1954 in the realm of poetry. The term movement was coined by J.D. Scott, the literary editor of The Spectator. So please remember the name J.D. Scott. Movement poets included a loose group of English poets. Movement poetry was in fact a reaction against neo-romantics. Movement poets never liked any traits of romanticism, and they were totally against romantic pleasures. They were also against excess of modernism. We already discussed how Larkin hated the industrialization in England. He uses the same pedestal even in the genre of poetry because he never got interested with the modern traits employed in poetry. They considered poetry as a disciplined craft, and the anthology titled as New Lines relating to what movement poetry is was published by Robert Conquest in the year 1956. So let's have a look at the major movement poets. The most important one among them is Kingsley Amis, the very close friend of Philip Larkin and the very famous author who became very popular with his work entitled as Lucky Jim. The second one is John Wayne, and there is only one lady in the group, and she is Elizabeth Jennings. Then comes DJ Enright, Tom Gunn. Tom Gunn doesn't require any kind of introduction. I'm sure you might have heard about his very famous poem, On the Move. Then comes Donald Davy, and then comes Robert Conquest, the writer of the anthology New Lines. You can see there are 7 poets here, and including Philip Larkin, in totality there are 8 writers who are considered as poets belonging to the genre of movement poetry. A few more points related with movement poetry. Movement poetry always had a very pessimistic tone. It was more like anti-romantic poetry, both in tone and style. But at the same time, if you look at the poems of Philip Larkin, you can see that most of his poems are not very pessimistic in its tone. And moreover, some of his poems even contain certain traits of romantic poetry. If you read these lines, you will get a feeling that Larkin's poems would be something which will not create any enthusiasm in a reader. But no, as a literature student, Larkin is one of my favorite poets. His poems are amazing and they really take you through a magical world. So coming back to movement poetry, it was more like anti-romantic poetry in tone and style. So the overall mood was pessimism. And as mentioned before, all poems of Larkin does not reflect this theme or tone. And the main idea of movement poetry was to re-establish the lost tradition of England. If you want to know more about movement poetry, there is a book by Blake Morrison. If you read this book, you will get more ideas based on what movement poetry is. Movement poetry also included formal verse and lucidity of expression, and by lucidity, it means clarity of expression. They also employed irony, understatements, and even mocking styles in their poems. In short, movement poetry was anti-modernist, anti-romantic, and anti-experimental. With this, we come to the end of this session, and we'll be continuing with part 3, which will be a detailed analysis on Larkin's poem, The Whitsun Weddings. So thank you very much for your patient listening. If you have any suggestions, doubts, or clarifications, please do not hesitate to connect with me in my email ID. Thank you once again. See you soon.